Mike in the shot. There's actually another version of the song Crazy by Seal. And this video is actually about the groove shadows of the song Crazy, which was one of the big songs that started my career. And today I was listening to it. I've listened to that song for over 20 years, maybe more. And it's a great song, it's a masterpiece. But today I just happened to realize, holy smokes, there's a ton of groove shadows in this reduction. And I actually studied a lot of Trevor Horn's work. And back when I was growing up, you had to acquire all these remix tapes and CDs and stuff to get unique versions of these pieces. And so one of them that I got was Crazy. And so I had like weird versions of Crazy, unique versions of Crazy. Now they're just everything and then some is on the internet, and it's very easy to get all of it. But I was like blown away at the time by like all the things going on. And I would literally sit and count the number of elements in the works so I could try to replicate my own productions to have those sort of number of elements to create a full production. And as I've gotten older, I can see where the groove shadows are, but I can also see where the key instruments played a much more prominent role, especially with how they interacted with the groove shadows. So when you hear the first part of the intro in Crazy by Seal, you have this floating, cool, like choir pad combination, and then in comes like a nice muted guitar, and then wham. So the first thing that happens is that a groove shadow is introduced in the low register. And that's the unknown part. The part that people focus on is the synth. Because, that's what you can hear in most environments, especially since the lower registry is harder to replicate, like on phones and whatnot. But that lower registry groove shadow that occurs simultaneously with that cool synthesizer is a glue. And that is a pivotal example of the significance of using the right combination of elements to create a monumental, construction that is so reinforced and so fortified and so way out there. How could they have possibly envisioned all this? Especially given that, at the time, they were just using like Fairlights and very hard to use systems. And they didn't have like this easy access to millions and millions and millions of kinds of sounds. So they really had to like be visionaries. But that first groove shadow that starts up with the synthesizer simultaneously, because that's one thing that occurs with Trevor Horn, is when you hear something, it's always a combination of two things minimum. And that's where it plays with your ear. And that trick is done a lot in classical music, and that's why I noticed it. Because that sort of syncopation of tonality is what the ear loves. It's just like, what am I really hearing? The ear wants to know, the mind's ear. So here's where that groove shadow plays a crucial role. The bass comes in with the drums and the other parts. And in that, the groove shadow is working as something I call a generator groove. And so you have this pulsing groove shadow. Then you have a matching melody, tonality with the bass. The drums and all the other things are tuned into that same melodic range. So everything is functioning to complement the rhythm of the groove shadow. Oh, and to clearly define that, what I'm talking about is there's a sound that's low register, and it sounds like you're shaking a shaker, except it's a very low volume where it's almost like an air conditioner or something like this. So it's a very low rumble. And so it's bum, 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 and that's the generator part. because the generator groove was more popular in the 80s. And it has something to do with like dancing and disco. So thinking of like a disco rhythm, you think about the bass guitar and how it go boom, bubba, boom, bubba, boom, bubba, boom, bubba, boom. And that's another kind of a generator. And when I'm using the term, I'm just saying that it doesn't really have a melodic function. It has more of a pulsating function. But there's a melody in it. And that's why it's a groove shadow, because it's not quite a melody and it's not quite percussion. And it's a timbre and it's like a tonality. So there's a lot going on with it, but it's not a normal sound. So anyways, there's a ton more groove shadows in that, but that's one of the most fundamental parts because the synth has interplay with that groove shadow. The bass is perfectly in line to create a generator groove with the groove shadow. And the style of the bass performance, which is a percussive style bass performance, is also having this interplay with, so you have the combination of the percussive bass, but then you have the combination of the melody of the bass, and then you have the combination of the synthesizer, all going off of this core pulsating air conditioner, maraca, shaker, whatever, that's happening in the low register. So it's almost like if you're, on life support and you have like a machine that's like pulsing, pum, 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 to the beat of like a heart rhythm or whatever. And I don't recall the tempo of Crazy. It's probably like around 125 or something, but I think I recall it being a very strange tempo because I think that because of the way it was recorded, it probably dips in and out of the actual quantization. And I have a feeling that has to do with something with the process of taping and bouncing for whatever they were doing back in the 80s or the late 80s, I mean. So that's one part of this. That low frequency generator groove, which can also be heard, funnily enough, in a more recent hit called Running Up That Hill. Only in this case, the generator groove, which is a groove shadow, which then has bass to complement it all, is much more prominent. And there's a link between those works because I happen to have had business work with a person who was involved on the production side of both of those pieces. But another part of this story is what I had mentioned in the beginning, which, and I'm not one to gossip, but there's another version of Crazy. So, and I'm not sure how much trouble I'll get into for saying this, because it was pulled from YouTube. And it stood out to me like a sore thumb. I was like, I've researched this song a long time, but I haven't heard this version. And so here's what I remember hearing. A little bit of a drier vocal and a little difference in the drum band. One thing I really remember was that there were a ton of hits when it does the breakdown part where the sort of Afro drumming comes in. And in that part, they had a ton more of orchestral hits, which is like a sound effect. That's a couple points on that. But what really blew me away about this alternate version of Crazy that I had heard was that, one, the entire production actually already existed, but in another form. So you hear about remix CDs, whereas this was most likely some kind of demo made from a 4-track, because back in the day, supposedly, that was what the artist was using to create and to produce and things like that. So it was either him doing that with the band that he was with at the time, because he was in a band touring around, like, I think it was, I want to say Japan. But anyway, the other part of it was that the synthesizer was more of an acid lead instead of the cool, buttery, like beautifully outlined, glossed over, majestic synth lead. And so all the entire production, from what I had heard in this piece, was already there. And it shocked me because I had worked with the person who did the production for the commercial version. And they had, they didn't tell me anything. I'm sure they had to sign in non-disclosures or whatever. But they had never mentioned anything about any of this older piece or what their actual work entailed. And I'm sure it was a lot because a lot of what they do in the production world of the albums and all that, there's always a person who does the brunt of the work that is sort of like a ghost technician. And so this person I work with was definitely falling under that category. They work with a lot of prominent people. So anywho, those are some ideas about what was going on with that secondary piece that is no longer available because I've been looking high and low. I even tried to find it in the Wayback Machine, and right around the time I tried to do that, somebody had hijacked the Wayback Machine, and I kind of gave up looking again. And I tried looking high and low. I'm really good at finding things when I want to. But anywho, so one other thing that I wanted to mention about Groove Shadows in this piece was in the chorus, you have a slappy, snappy zipper sound. And based on the recollection, I think it's something to do with the bass or something. But anyway, that sound is very important to sort of break up the transition between the verse and the chorus, because we have all this coolness of the verse, and then we have to somehow come up with something cool in the chorus. And so that's where the direction they went with this. So you have the pulsing synthesizer in the background, but then you have this introduction of this sort of zipper noise that sort of beefs up the syncopation. So that's another groove shadow I wanted to mention. And there's a ton more in the piece, from the layers of the drumming, other things that are happening later on as it transcends more into like a disco work or whatever. But those key ones create a seal, no pun intended, around the piece where it's like you're never going to, match this unless you did all of these elements. So this is an example of how far 80s producers and 90s producers, early 90s producers would go to create what didn't exist. They didn't have as highly advanced synthesis at the time, but they had to be super visionary. And so when I was younger, that's sort of what I had to do, because I grew up sort of, lesser income. And I had to stretch my imagination, even though in the end I just ended up spending a lot of money chasing after synthesizers and whatnot, because I was just so obsessed with synths. They just were the coolest thing ever. So, so that's the critical, understanding of all that with significance of Groove Shadow, how it tied in to every layer of this production, and why Groove Shadows is a totally, significant part of production that nobody talks about. Why don't they talk about it? Because it separates the AMs from the pros massively, and you have to be like PhD level to understand how to use them, how to really take the motif and then blow it up so that it all is working in lockstep with the groove shadow. That's why I got involved with creating these things, and the idea of an entire, composition made from sound design, because you don't have to have composition the way it works. But what's changed in my older years is this revelation that, there's a reason that they did the rhythms the way that they did. And that's because dance is king in a lot of the modern, aesthetic. Even when it's trap or whatever, it's got to have a danceable thing. Because for me, the Groove Shadow was like, we've got to break the loop of the rhythm section. And all I was hearing was the same style grooves, even if it was funky and cool and breakbeat and cutting edge. I said, we have to transcend beyond what we thought we could do with rhythm. And that's what Groove Shadows is about, because of the jagged ways of the rhythms of the sounds, and then pulling them out of their shells or more into the limelight, so that becomes an instruction set to the overall feeling of the groove, the aesthetic of the groove. So I'll leave it at that. And those are some thoughts on that song, Crazy, and then also the significance that the Groove Shadows played in that production and in music production in general.